I grew up on the West Coast. No, I grew up on the West Coast. Japanese.
All right, hello again, everyone, for the final time for people who have heard me speak before. We are going to get started one more time. I have been told that the pronunciation is very French, so this is Denis Labossiere. And he also doesn't have a bio that I'm going to read because he has his own bio stuff.
Correct. Yeah. Everyone can hear me, right? I don't like the way my voice sounds in these things, so I just want to make sure. Welcome. This is a DFIR case study investigating a malicious script within Microsoft Intune. So first, before we get into the who am I and why you should be here, let me talk to you about what I'm going to talk about. We're going to go over the agenda. We're going to baseline Intune. We're going to talk about some forensic analysis. I'm going to give you the tools that were used for this analysis, some of the research I used to build the lab, conduct the analysis, and all that. Then I'm going to give you a little summary. So first things first, who am I? I'm Denis Labossiere, Labossiere, however you want to pronounce it, all good. I have about 10 years of digital forensics incident response experience, all with KPMG. For those that understand or if it matters, I have a master's and a bachelor's degree, both from Utica College, a couple hours down the road, both in cybersecurity, digital forensics, cybercrime, cyber operations. I do have a couple of certifications, and for those for it matters, GCFE, GCFA, Sentinel-1 Siren certification, and a few from MITRE ATT&CK Defender. What are my passions? Well, I love investigating ransomware incidents. I hate when they happen, but I do love investigating them. I love anything DFIR. But a big passion of mine over the last couple of years is one of the big buzzwords in the industry, which is threat hunting. I enjoy threat hunting a whole hell of a lot. I love to be able to solve puzzles and find problems, and when puzzle pieces are missing, some people would get really annoyed. I get really zoned in. I want to find that puzzle piece. And with that, I like to do some detection engineering or just building detection logic and queries so that threat hunting doesn't necessarily have to happen anymore, but we can detect on it if it does happen. And then about me, who am I? Why do you want to be here? And why am I interesting? Well, I'm not, but I am a husband. I'm a father of two little boys, a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. I was a former collegiate baseball player at Utica, so I'm very familiar with RIT's campus. I had to run around the campus because I played pitcher. So when I pitched, I had to run around the campus, so about 3 miles every time I was here, and I did 4 years of the school, so I was here a lot. And then I am a glamour camper. For anyone that doesn't understand what that means, yeah, I glamp. That means I have power. Yeah, and toilets. I have electricity, so I can sleep at night with some AC and what have you. And my in-laws have a nice little mobile home on a creek bed, so we can do some fishing right outside the door. I love that. And I do love to cook. My dad's a chef. With them, what's in it for me? Why do I want you to be here? What are you going to learn? Well, I love this saying, we all have something to learn. And that's something I learned early in my career. One of my mentors said to me. It's something I've been saying ever since then. We all have something to learn. And in this case, we have something to understand. Some of you may not know what Microsoft Intune is. Some of you may not know what DFIR is. In this case, we're going to talk through the processes and some of the artifacts that would exist from cloud to on-prem. So we can build new defensive measures as a result. We can get a new analytical technique. Maybe we didn't know you could go to this specific registry key or have this event log this information. Or maybe you just understood or found a new data source as a result of this talk. Secondly, remember to use all available telemetry. If an attack happens in the cloud, like it did in this case, but it pivoted to on-prem, well, we have log sources in at least 2 different places. The endpoint that was affected on-prem and the cloud. Well, and then I'm going to share a story from the trenches. This is a case study after all. So I'm going to talk to you about the real world case that inspired this talk. And then because I have a passion for detection engineering, maybe you will develop that passion as well, and you'll build a new defensive technique or a detection query based on this information. Some caveats. I recreated this case in a test lab. So this was done at my own expense, on my own time. I built a test environment. It contained a single Windows 10 virtual machine and a Microsoft Azure Entra ID connected, managed by Intune. So I had an Intune, Entra, all free with the trial licenses, and a VM. Great. When you come to talks, you may hear an agenda, and someone told me they were ex-military, so those military folks, you'll understand this. Tell me what you're going to tell me, and then tell me what you told me. This is the tell me what you're going to tell me, all right? I'm going to provide a brief background on a real-world intrusion that inspired this talk. We're going to baseline Microsoft Intune because in order to find evil, you have to know normal. To have normal, you have to have a baseline. I'm going to describe to you the methodology and available telemetry forensic information so you can do something similar in your network if it's Intune managed. I'm going to recreate the attack in a lab environment. We're going to walk through it. I'm going to list the tools, as I mentioned in the agenda, and then I'm going to provide the research. Great. Incident background. June 10th, 2023, approximately 12:33 in the morning, real early, right, UTC, KPMG responded to an incident at one of our clients where their global admin in Azure was SIM swapped. The attacker then removed global admin from every other user account in the environment, except for the account that they now controlled, effectively locking the client out of their Azure environment. This is Scattered Spider, for those that don't know. They go by a lot of other names, Lucre 3, Star Fraud, Octo Tempest, whatever you want to know them. Scattered Spider is the CrowdStrike name. Other ones have other nomenclatures. Regardless, they're known as Scattered Spider. On June 13th, 3 days later, it was uncovered that this attacker had modified a Intune script that existed in the client environment named Update Teams Firewall Rules. Great. Sounds pretty normal about what that would do. We can all anticipate that that probably updated the local firewall rule to allow Microsoft Teams. That was created by the client and it existed in the environment before. The way Intune works is you have a script, also known as a policy, and it runs an underlying script, in this case was PowerShell, and that PowerShell script was aptly named Update Teams Firewall Rules.ps1. That script was modified by the attacker. And what that did was it downloaded a EDR solution from another client that Scattered Spider had compromised and pushed that to a group of endpoints managed by Intune and installed SentinelOne all in one script. The problem with that is our client's EDR was CrowdStrike. So this is fairly easy to detect from a forensic response standpoint of, hey, if you run CrowdStrike in your environment, but SentinelOne's being installed in these endpoints, that gives us a pivot point. It also lets us know that there's telemetry available to us. So that's the attack background. Next, we're going to baseline Intune. We have to know normal to find evil. So the first thing you're going to want to do is get your user object IDs for all your users in your environment. This will come in handy later. In this case, in my test lab, my user principal name was Labossiere at dlintunetesting@microsoft.com. And I have an object ID, GUID, whatever you want to call it, of that value. That will come into play later. You don't have to memorize it. I will show it, I will point it out. But you'll want to know that for every user, particularly those that manage Intune. Okay, when you get Intune and you start it up, there's no pre-existing scripts. So the only scripts that will exist are the ones that you have there. So if you don't have any, and then all of a sudden you have one, probably an attacker or maybe someone went rogue. But you shouldn't have any if you don't have Intune. So the first thing that I had done was I created 2 scripts. I wanted to have a test bed. Script 1 created a folder named test on the desktop of user A, user 1, whatever. The second script did the same thing, but for user B. That was it. Simply create directory, this user's desktop, done. In Intune, that's the right-hand side of the screen. Some of it's cut off. Slides will be there later. On the right side of the screen, you get information that is useful, these properties, like the name of the Intune script, and that's not the underlying PowerShell script, it's just the Intune script. You get the credentials if it's running as user or running as system. You get the underlying PowerShell script name, and if it was included or excluded groups. So who's receiving or who isn't receiving this policy, this script. The other thing you'll want to know is the script ID. There's two ways to get this, Microsoft Graph API or in the URL. And I've highlighted that here. That is also important. So you'll want to grab that. Okay. If you're using the Graph API, you have to first get a bearer token or authentication token. So if you hit a post to that API endpoint and you provide it 3 specific values, your Azure tenant ID, which is going to go in the URL, and then the application that is going to be hitting the Graph API, it needs a client ID, which is the application ID. I don't know why in this it's called client, and the client secret. Then you have successfully authenticated to the tenant with that application to then get a bearer token to use that application to hit the Graph API to do your calls. So where do you get your Azure tenant ID? In the home of Azure, you'll have your tenant ID in the overview pane. That is your tenant ID. I've redacted it. This lab doesn't exist anymore, so even if you were able to get this lab is dead. But that's the tenant ID. Then you have to have an application. You have to register that application. And once you do that, you will have an application ID. That is the object ID in the API call. And then you have to have a client secret, which is passed along. So you can see here that I did create that. It is a little redacted, of course. But that is your Azure registration application client secret, which is then used for the authentication request. So once you have all that and you make that post request, you get your bearer token. Obviously redacted for security purposes. Doesn't exist anymore. I think it lives for like 2 days, maybe 24 hours. Okay. So now you have a token. Now you can authenticate as that application to make calls to the Graph API to pull information. This is the only way you can get specific information about any Intune script and underlying PowerShell script information. So what I mean by that is, yes, in the user interface, you will see the properties that I showed before, but what you cannot see is the contents of the PowerShell script. To get the contents of the PowerShell script, you have to do these next 2 steps using the Graph API. So this first here is a get to one of their beta API endpoints, device management scripts with your bearer token. Don't worry about seeing that. I'll blow it up here a little bit, but you probably still can't see it. But what you're getting is description, created time, last modification time, the PowerShell script name, and the scope, right? And a bunch of information that you really want to know to track something down, right? So how does that tie back to Intune? Well, as I mentioned, they do, right? So you have an ID, the script ID, you have a display name, the property name, you have the underlying PowerShell script. It all matches. Microsoft being Microsoft, the API is in UTC, Azure is in EST, or browser time. So that happens. All right. Now that we understand what our Intune environment looks like from a baseline perspective, I want to understand what the contents of the PowerShell scripts look like as well. Well, to the same API endpoint, then tacking on that script ID value, you can get the contents of that script. The catcher is it's base64 encoded. The lovely part about that is really easy to decode. So here I'm showing the display name of the property, the script content, and you can see it's base64 encoded. Again, I have creation time, all the lovely timestamps that we love. And using CyberChef, from base64, give me the value. And as I mentioned, very benign script. New item path, someone's desktop, name test. It's a directory, super simple, very benign, very easy to understand. So what does that look like on the endpoint? Exactly that. It is a directory name test on the user's desktop. So, and I'm showing that here for both. We have it in the Windows Explorer, and then we have it in the UI Explorer itself. And then below, preview of some things to come, there are some logs that Microsoft gives us in plain text that tracks this information, which is so lovely. And in that, we not only have that the push of the policy from Intune to the endpoint completed, we get date and timestamps, and in this case, we actually get the returned information to standard out in clear text in the log as well. So let's dive into why I'm really here, my passion, the forensics analysis. So let me just recap again real quick. In order to find evil, you have to know normal. We had to baseline our environment. I had no scripts there previously. I created 2 scripts to kind of simulate an environment that doesn't have nothing. They do absolutely nothing except create a directory on the user's desktop. So what happens if an attacker were to modify a script? Well, if a script is modified, the last modification date will be updated to the time that the modification occurred, but the script ID stays the same. I thought that was a little interesting, but I understand why it stays the same. But I was kind of wondering, like, oh, if I update the script and the script ID is different, it should change. Well, really, what you're modifying is the underlying PowerShell. If you modify the properties of the script, it still doesn't change the script ID. But you can see here that the script was modified. It was created on the 9th of February. It was modified on the 11th. So 2 days had passed in my environment. The hacker came in, modified the script. All right. Well, let's go back through the API and let's pull this information. I want the properties of the script. I want the contents. What did the attacker change? So you can see here the original script. The script content is 1 line, maybe 60 characters or so, base64. The modified script is a lot bigger. So now the script should be doing more. There's more characters here. It's a bigger script. Well, that's strange. It got modified. Again, base64, very easy to decode. Drop it in, CyberChef from base64 recipe, boom. Can anyone see what's happening here? For those in the back that can't, the attacker, in this case me, is setting a URL variable to download anydesk.com, then setting an output file equal to the path I want it saved at a.exe, very common for attackers to name their binaries very, very small. And in this case, probably want to obfuscate that it's an RMM tool, remote management and monitoring tool, in this case, AnyDesk. And then I am running that process and installing AnyDesk on the computer, all remotely from Intune with a PowerShell script. And as you would have expected, just like the other PowerShell script that ran to create the test directory, magic. It worked. AnyDesk is now running on the system, and that means that it all pushed down. Now, the snippet below here is from a second log source, and this one records the contents of the PowerShell script in clear text. What you also see here that I've highlighted nicely for everyone is this thing known as the Intune policy hash. That may not be the official name, it's kind of what I've dubbed it, but it's the policy hash. That'll come into play in a little bit. So, with forensic evidence, if we think about this from a DFIR perspective, attacker got into the cloud, they did some shenanigans in the cloud, they pivoted to on-prem through the use of the cloud because the on-prem system was hybrid joined to the cloud managed by Intune. And then they did something on-prem, on the endpoint. They created a file, they executed a binary, and they made web requests. Well, that actually gives us a lot to think about and a lot of forensic evidence to look for. One of the first places that I'm going to look is the journal. Just what I like to do, probably not the best thing to look at first, but in this talk, we're going to look at it first. And I'll tell you why. So, the journal. The reason why I'm showing the journal first is when a push from Intune down to the endpoint, that policy occurs and then the script runs, there are 4 files that get created, but then very quickly deleted. And the journal is the only thing that catches it. And this is all related to and normal Microsoft Intune management behavior. So these 4 files are up here. You're not going to read the names real quick, but program files, x86, Microsoft Intune, blah, 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 blah. PowerShell, or so it's .ps1, timeout, error, and output. Those are the 4 files. PS1, timeout, error, output. They get created and deleted. They get created and deleted in less than 2.5 seconds or 3 seconds. But knowing that they exist tells you that a push down from Intune occurred. So if you didn't have Intune to look at, you have an idea of a time frame of when the script at least was pushed to the endpoint. And then your other forensic artifacts will give you and fill in the blanks some of the other times. In this case, the MFT. The MFT, unlike the journal, won't show you the file creation or deletion of these 4 files, but what it will tell you is file size of the files, that the result of the script, in this case a.exe. We know that AnyDesk was ran, it got downloaded, got created, and it got installed. So we have the result of a.exe being created, and then we have the result of AnyDesk being installed and its default files being created on the system. We also have file size. So one thing we can do with that, you can download AnyDesk yourself and compare file sizes. Is this legitimately AnyDesk, or is it some modified version? Or did they compromise AnyDesk's CDN and maybe host their own malware, supply chain attack, right? Okay. That's file creation events. There were other things, right? Like PowerShell. Well, PowerShell gets logged in the Windows event logs in 2 places. There are 2 PowerShell logs that are of use. Me being very quick to want to recreate this and then actually sit down and plan this very well, I didn't turn on logging, like verbose logging for PowerShell. So I don't have 4104 event IDs in the main I know, I'm sad too. Someone else can pick this up and do it. But I know maybe one person. But what you do get is execution time, evidence of execution time in the event logs with the 600 and 400. You kind of know when it started and when it ended. They're not exact timestamps, they're approximate timestamps. But you know that PowerShell ran. This is a way to tell you. And you know it's specifically Intune because PowerShell is running, and of course, Microsoft execution policy bypass. And this is allowed because it's coming from Intune, so it's trusted. Program files, x86, Microsoft Intune management. So this is definitely coming from Intune. All right. So we know that that ran. All right. What else did we talk about? We talked about this Intune policy hash that we found in the log. Well, where the heck do you find that? How about another great Microsoft artifact, the registry? The registry will actually record this in the software, local machine software, Microsoft Intune Management Extension, policies. And then I've highlighted 2 boxes here, one in red and one in black. Do any of these things look familiar to anybody? What are they? It's the user ID first and then the script ID second. So if you have 2 scripts, would you expect 2 registry entries? Yeah, you would, right? Huh? No. No, my friend Jessica, we will show the second one. No, we will show the second one. So, yeah. The big point here is the value, registry value name actually is policy hash, but you also get some of the other information you got from Intune properties, right? Run as account, target type, last updated. And then the other thing you'll notice is there's some clear text embedded going on. Again, that looks like the returned to standard output information we got. So 2 artifact sources telling you the same thing. Bart's like a cat. I'm sorry. I don't got cats. Bart's like a dog. Why is it tail like a dog? It looks like a dog. It's probably a dog. Here's 2 things telling you the same thing. We can cut that part out, right? Hey, we're not perfect, all right? All right. So here, we're looking at a modified Intune script. So what we're seeing here is now that kind of clear text standard output doesn't get returned, but that makes sense if you think about the PowerShell script that ran the second time. There was no standard output to return. It was a couple of variables, and then download that file and run it. It's going to close the command prompt once that's done. There's no standard output return, so you don't get that down here. but everything else kind of stays the same. Last updated, policy hash, target type, run as account. In this case, this is a different script. This is a different script than the original one, right? So the other one was F5A. This one is AB8. All right. So we're almost through the forensics part for anyone who might be falling asleep. Okay, but we talked about now MFT, journal, PowerShell event log, registry. What's left? How about the Intune logs themselves? The Intune logs themselves. Well, we have 3 places to look at for Intune logs. And here you are, clear paths, right? Program files, x86, Microsoft Intune management extension, policy scripts, and then the other one is policy results. So the scripts folder contains the PowerShell script file, one of the 4 files created that you saw in the journal, but it gets quickly deleted. That's where it gets stored. So it'll run from there. The other 3 files get stored in the results, and they also get quickly deleted. So those 2 paths won't really tell you anything. But those are where the files are created, so they're of use. The last place, and everything good happens in program data, but the path changes because Microsoft. Program data, Microsoft, now it's / Intune management extension, one word, no spaces. What happens? Logs. We love logs. We want to look at logs. We love logs. We have a song about logs. We love logs. In this case, you get 2 logs. You get agent executor and you get Intune management extension. So agent executor, to me, sounds like the Intune agent executing the policy from Intune. And Intune management extension sounds like, to me, here's the details about the execution. I don't know that for sure. I'm just going by name, and that to me makes sense. And then I put here that it's unclear whether what log file kind of records what. I've done more testing since I had written this presentation originally, and I wanted to keep it because I'm not 100% certain. But to me, as I mentioned earlier, agent executor seems to record the standard out if there is any. If there isn't, the whole content of the script gets put into Intune management extension.log. So I haven't done a whole lot of testing with it. Again, I kind of just built this lab environment to recreate the attack that I thought was really interesting because I'm always interested by, you got on the cloud first and then you got to on-prem, but how? Well, now that we know how, I wanted to recreate it, and I haven't gone. So if anyone wants to go the step further, please, by all means, help the community. So let's look at these logs. What am I doing on time? Okay. Let's look at these logs. So agent executor.log. This is a snippet. This isn't the full log, but this is a snippet of the log file. And what we can see here again is the command line of the actual PowerShell script running the PowerShell script, right? Intune's PowerShell script running it. So we have the PowerShell's running with no profile, execution policy bypass, the file itself, and then it's referring to the user ID GUID, the script ID GUID.ps1. And then we get the output, right? But we also get time. So this is a very verbose log. There's a lot of information in here, a lot of timestamps, and a lot of information to dig into. I haven't come across like a parser for these. I wish I was a programmer and a coder to do that. If anyone wants to, please go ahead. They're just log files. They're not crazy. But that's not my skill set. I'm sorry. I wish. But please. Then Intune management extension. You kind of get the same information here, but in this one, you'll see the 4 files that we saw in the journal are recorded here. And then we also get the fact that, besides there's timestamps, we also get that the user profile was loaded. It gives you a username. You get the environment block was created. It launched PowerShell. And then down below, you get a snippet of some JSON. And again, Microsoft just loves to change the names of things in different places. So policy ID is actually the script ID. Policy hash is the policy hash. But you also get the full embedded in policy body. It's the actual decoded contents of the script that's not base64 encoded because it ran on the system and Microsoft has to do that to run it. Thanks for that, Microsoft. That was a good thing. Okay. That's the endpoint. Those are the forensic artifacts that I found interesting and useful to the investigation. There may be more, certainly user assist, but mostly that's just going to tell you what you already know. PowerShell ran, and it ran by a user, and it ran at this time. So absolutely, I'm not saying ignore it. I'm just saying for the sake of this, I was kind of trying to point out the artifacts that will at least point you to the whole embodiment of something from Intune ran, and then potentially what it was, and how you get it in two places, endpoint and cloud. So, leveraging all available telemetry, let's go back to the cloud. There's some interesting things to know there. Azure logging. So as I mentioned earlier, the Graph API had to be a registered application. In Microsoft, that means service principal. There are service principal sign-in logs. Now, that may not be useful because an attacker may not actually be logging in as an application or doing a function as an application, and they didn't in this case. But I included this anyway because here I was using my app to run the Graph API, and I saw these sign-ins, and I thought it was interesting because I'm going back and, hey, I'm testing, I'm running something, what does that look like? But I know attackers register applications, especially in the BEC side of things, and they perform actions as that service principal or that application. So you should be checking for these things. Again, may not be applicable to this investigation particularly or specifically, but still of interest. Again, no normal, find evil. So here, the Azure detailed sign-in, you can see I'm highlighting the things that map back to one another. So service principal ID in this case is the actual object ID of the enterprise application because, again, Microsoft can't keep them consistent between two things. The credential key ID is the secret ID from the registered application. The resource service principal ID is Graph API, and they're color-coded. So how does that compare to if you actually pull that down like JSON from the API? Well, you get all the same information just in JSON format. And I was kind enough to kind of map those back to one another. So the color coding of red matches to the red on the side, purple, blue, all of those fun little colors map back to one another. So whether you pull it from the Azure UI in the audit log or sign-in logs, or you pull it from the Graph API, you'll get the same information. Timestamps beware. Okay, so you know what happened when I said what happens when you modify a script? So if user A modifies a script by user A, it probably doesn't change much but the timestamp. But what happens if user B modifies a script by user A? Nothing. It doesn't actually change anything. The modification time will change. But one interesting note is, and we'll get to it, but basically, I did this. I set up another user. I modified a script that my original user had created. The modification time did change, but the Graph API didn't really note anything different. Again, the script ID didn't change. The modification time did, but it didn't tell me who did the change. And also, the object ID didn't change. So that tells me that when you set up a Intune policy, property, script, whatever you want to call it, they use script twice, and it just annoys me a little bit. But when you set up an Intune policy to do a thing, and that's done by user A, it's tied to user A's identity. Even if user B were to modify it, it's still tied to user A, which gives us some interesting things forensically. So here's script modified by user B. We can see that the script ID doesn't change, the display name didn't change, the contents did change because user B now modified this script, so the modification changed, but nothing else really changed, right? There's still the same properties of run as the account. In this case, the file name of the PowerShell script changed, so it's noted here, but it didn't really change anything else. And again, we can base 64 it. So all I'm doing is in Intune getting the properties of A.exe. Very simple, just what is A.exe? Intune, right, different from Azure, Intune has an audit log, and this was new to me, and this was like, after I had built this presentation, like 3 months later, I was like, hold on, wait, Intune has an audit log? I wonder what that has in it. So, I have the Intune audit log, And as I mentioned, you will know in Intune, in the audit log, that a script was modified and who modified the script. That Intune audit log actually captured that information. So patch device management script is Microsoft's nomenclature for modification of a script. The UPN or user principal name is the user who performed the action. The object ID is the script ID of the modified script. So again, if you pull this with the API, the JSON code is the same as what's in the UI, just in JSON. Okay. Well, as I mentioned, if user A is modifying, user B is modifying a script that user A created and runs that script, what does that look like on the endpoint? Well, it doesn't really change anything. Again, the user ID, the user object GUID, and the script ID are still tied to the original user. So you really have to go back to the Intune audit log to say, hey, user B modified this, then pushed it down, even though on the endpoint it's going to look like user A ran it. And one of the biggest problems we have in forensics, and those with experience know, is tying someone behind the keyboard to an action. And in this case, if you took it at face value, you would think that user A did this action, but that's not necessarily true. And we know that maybe user B didn't really do the action, but the person controlling the identity of user B performed the action. So that's really important. And that, again, goes back to leveraging all telemetry. You can't just rely on one thing to tell you it happened. You need multiple sources, and that's how you get to a fact, right? Or close to it in our world. The scientific method would come into play. So, hey, I see this is running as user A with our user A's ID, and it's this script. But what is that script, and who modified it, if anything? Go back to Intune. You can't find that on the endpoint. Okay, as I promised, what tools did I use to get to the information and forensic artifacts and the analysis and the conclusions that I reached? In this case, I used KPMG's proprietary forensic triage tool known as KDR, KPMG Digital Responder. That was the screenshots from like the journal and the MFT. Those were from some of our automated reports. A local copy of CyberChef at the time was 10.5.2. I want to say they're on like 10.9 or something now. This was definitely an older copy. I used Zimmerman's Registry Explorer for those that are familiar with it. I don't think he's updated that version because I think it's always been 1600. And then new to me, as I mentioned, I'm not a great programmer or coder, but new to me is kind of PowerShell coding. And on the screen here, you'll know that I have my GitHub here, shameless little personal plug. On that GitHub link, I uploaded a tool last night publicly. It was private for a while, but it's now public. Thank you. Yeah, I'll get there. I'm just spitting through the words. That PowerShell script is to help you pull the information from Intune audit. So it's an automated PowerShell script to download the Intune audit log in the JSON format that you're seeing. So all that JSON code you were seeing earlier is from my script. Is it the best? Definitely not. Will it get you information? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then, as far as the resources that I had used to make this presentation, obviously the Azure portal, I had to set up a tenant, I had to add some users, I had to enable Intune and all the licenses that come with that. Obviously used Intune, and then I used the Graph API. And because I believe in giving back to the community, one of the reasons why we do these presentations and we open source things is I had done a lot of research to try to figure out API calls. Again, not my specialty, but something that I dove into because I was really curious. So here are the API endpoints. And to get you the information that I got to in my presentation, maybe there's some more efficiency of querying these endpoints to get that information, but I'm providing them nonetheless if you wanted to use the API and do this programmatically rather than in the UI. Now the research time. Obviously, I didn't do this alone. It took a team, right? I didn't do this whole investigation alone with KPMG. We were probably 10 or 15 people on the whole that project at the time, all had different roles. If I didn't say it before, the company did end up being ransomed as a result of this initial access through Azure, SimSwap, through on-prem, got an admin account on-prem, ESXi, ransom, all that fun stuff. So we had a bunch of people doing a number of different tasks, analysis, recovery, all of that. But what it came down to was, okay, first off, what is Intune? What does it contain? Secondly, what logging exists in Intune, if any? Where do the logs exist in Intune, in Azure, on a machine? And some things about the API itself, like how do I query this in the API? And if I go back here, like this middle query here for the beta audit log with the service principal and the % 27, I definitely didn't know that or come up with that. I found that on Stack Overflow. So thank you to the person who posted that there, and I definitely gave them credit. They're number 6. But all of these articles, blogs, researchers, etc., kind of paved the way and set the groundwork for where I ended up going. Thank you to Scattered Spider for doing this, to allow me to do this, to recreate this attack. You seem mad that I thanked them. But they allowed this. So I have to say, a little, hey, juicy little nuggets here and there that I hadn't seen before from them because they evolve all the time. But nonetheless, so that was the research that paved the groundwork for where I went with it. I hope someone else picks this up. I think there's definitely things to talk about extra, like what does the EDR catch with this? What does logging to Sentinel or any other SIM understand, and how is that parsed? Because there are Intune integrators to Microsoft Sentinel, their SIM, but what does that telemetry look like, and are you able to build detections further in the SIM and or EDR if this were to happen? Would it detect a modification? Can you detect a modification? Maybe malicious, maybe not, but are you alerting on that? Are you even aware that scripts are being modified all the time in Intune? I'm sure they may be, especially if you're pushing, packages or applications out that have different versions. But are you checking that that's done by a person who should be doing that, and that the content of that PowerShell script is accurate and it's meant to do what it wants to do, and not something like downloading a different EDR? So, tell me what you tell me, or tell me what you're going to tell me. Then tell me right now. Tell me what you told me. So, I provided a brief background on the incident that inspired this talk, right? I detailed how to baseline an Intune environment using different information, including the Graph API, how to decode base64 period, encoded PowerShell scripts, what that looks like. We analyzed a Windows endpoint, in this case a Windows 10 endpoint. We looked at the journal, we looked at the MFT, PowerShell event logs, we looked at the registry, we looked at Intune application or Intune logs themselves. I provided the tools that I had used for this. I provided the research that I had used to assist with this presentation. So I think I hit all the objectives that I said I was going to hit. If I didn't, please let me know. And looks like we're good on time. So I will skip the question part in a second just to hit the thank yous to everyone that helped me with this. So KPMG, obviously, for allowing me to do this and having the investigation themselves. My wife and family, all my friends and mentors, and you all for sitting here and listening to me speak. And just a little bit about who I am, some of my contact information in the company, because they did allow me to come here and allowed this presentation. That's why it's branded. Question time. I will pass the mic because I have this one. So any questions? Thank you. Yes, sir.
If all I have is a good computer and a very small budget, is there any chance I can recreate this lab that you had?
I did this for free.
Really? Okay.
It
I was
cost me
expecting
nothing.
licenses costs.
No,
No.
You get a trial for 30 days
Okay.
for Azure. You have to put a credit card in. So,
Okay.
so there's that.
I think I got to that point in the past and then didn't.
And you get like $200 in credits. But I didn't have a VM in Azure. I used my own VM on VMware. And like I said, I used the trial license for Azure AD, and I used the trial license for Intune. It cost me nothing. After 28 days, I literally destroyed everything, canceled the subscription, removed my credit card information. Cost me nothing. So you can absolutely do this. And one of the reasons why I did it was because I could do it for free. I would have spent money, but I did it for free.
Are your slides available somewhere?
They will be on my GitHub after I redact all the screenshots and embed them as pictures so people can't re-download them and then change the redactions, even though everything doesn't exist. So all the GUIDs and all of that don't matter, but just for safety's sake, if I'm going to preach it, I'm going to practice it. So yes, they will be on my GitHub.
Does someone have a question?
Sure, over here, next to the gentleman. Yep.
So if I were to attempt to recover any of those deleted files from the Intune script, one, do you know if through Intune, if they come with a mark of the web, alternate data stream, and two, if anything useful would be in that URI? Like any UIDs or
So
any of that information?
when you say the files, are you referring to those 4 PS1 timeout, error, and output?
Yeah.
I honestly don't think they're going to be of value, to be honest with you. They sound like more like debugging, right? So the .ps1 file is probably going to be the contents that you can get from the Graph API anyway, because it's running on the endpoint. It has to know what to run. So it's just pushing it down to the endpoint and running it. And the error, timeout, output to me sound like debugging values. So like if it errored out, I would kind of expect the script, that file, to stay. But because there was no error, there's no necessary output. I'm not asking it to necessarily perform an action. And there's no timeout because it ran successfully, and there was no error. It ran successfully. So could you grab those files? Yeah, probably if you were quick enough. But I mean, it runs fairly quickly, like 3 seconds. So you have that much time. Maybe if you snapshotted the VM, but you got to be quick. As far as like network traffic to your endpoint from Azure, it's probably all coming from Microsoft services. You're not going to get anything unique there. And your user ID is tied in the file name, right? And then you know that from the journal. So you know the user that was controlled to run it or who created the script, and then you know the script itself. So again, you can pull all that from the Graph API.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir. Any other questions? There's definitely no dumb questions, by the way.
This is more of a comment because we love logs.
Yeah, we do.
There is a log source in Microsoft tenants called Graph Activity where you can pull down all of the Graph API calls. It's a real pain in the butt to get to. You can't just like access it through an API call, but you are able to see like failures and reads and stuff that you wouldn't normally get in the Intune logs or in the Entra sign in activity. Unified audit logs out of 365. So if you're looking to baseline your tenant and know what normal is, that's like a super, super, super valuable resource.
For normal like Graph API calls. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Applications are interacting with each other and who's using the graphics.
Absolutely, yeah. You definitely would want to know that. Absolutely, I can see that being a value. Anything else? Any other questions? Come on, don't be shy. I obviously love to talk. Gentleman in the back. These 3 know. These 4 know.
If the organization that was compromised here, they were using CrowdStrike, so were they just not monitoring when the agent faulted?
The agent didn't fault. So,
but it got replaced, right?
No, it didn't. The attacker downloaded a separate EDR solution. It didn't replace the EDR. It didn't knock it off. It just downloaded a separate EDR. And then the attackers used that EDR as a backdoor to bring in more backdoors, which then gave them a larger foothold and whatnot. But CrowdStrike definitely did not get knocked off. Didn't get bypassed. It never would have detected that. It's a normal application. And it came from Microsoft, right? I mean, the Intune script pulled down and then downloaded another application. There's no way for it to detect that.
Just as a comment on this attacker too, they live off the land. Mm-hmm. So they're sysadmins, essentially. They're not really using malware, so using an EDR as malware is par for the course.
Yeah, and that was compromised from another client, right? So client A was the one we responded to. Client B, somewhere in the stratosphere, compromised. They used their EDR agent to push into client A in their environment and then leveraged that client to remote shell in and bring their tools in. And then once they had their backdoor, they didn't need them anymore. They were good. Any other questions? Nothing's off limits. You want to ask me about glamping? I'll gladly tell you.
I love glamping.
Obviously, I do too. I'm boasting about it. Never. Never.
We heard the Freudian slip on the cats versus dogs.
I don't even know where that came from. Because I've watched this one with the memes of the